The warning light did not turn red. Red meant impact, breach, reactor fault, things with instructions already attached to them. What appeared on monitor Jalen Mar's screen was a pale ring of silver around a single black point, and for 3 full seconds he only stared at it because he had no memory of ever seeing that symbol outside training. He had been on watch for 5 hours and 12 minutes. He had half a ration bar left beside the console, 1 boot unlaced under the desk, and a report open on a secondary screen about a customs drone that had gone missing near the dust lanes. Border Relay 9 was not a glorious posting. It sat at the far bend of the Cinder Reach where official maps became cautious and traffic became rare. Its job was to notice small things before they became large ones and, more often than not, to notice nothing at all. The silver ring remained on the screen. Jalen reached for the manual before he reached for the alarm. He hated himself for that immediately, but habit was older than fear. He keyed open the sensor lexicon and searched the symbol index with fingers that had suddenly become too careful. The result appeared at once. Contact state, archival null. Meaning, observed object does not correspond to any active registry, retired registry, military reserve list, colonial ghost file, or known debris class. Action, do not assume sensor fault. Escalate to command without delay. Jalen read it twice. Then he hit the escalation key hard enough to hurt. The relay acknowledged him with a single clean tone. Somewhere 2 decks below, a duty light changed color. The rest of the station remained ordinary for another few seconds. Fans whispered in the vents. The station clock advanced without urgency. Somebody laughed in the corridor outside at something not yet aware it belonged to a different day than the one now beginning in the sensor room. Jalen expanded the contact pane. Range, 6.2 million kilometers. Velocity, steady. Drive trace, present. He swallowed. A drive trace meant thrust. Thrust meant intent, or at the very least a machine still obeying intent after someone had left it long ago. Dead rock did not produce thrust. Broken wreckage drifted, tumbled, shed heat in ugly irregular size. This thing moved in a straight line with engine output so smooth the system had not assigned it error bars yet. Deputy Commander Ilya Sorin arrived in under 2 minutes wearing a fatigue coat over sleep clothes and a sidearm she had forgotten to secure properly at the hip. She took one look at the symbol on Jalen's display and stopped beside him so quickly her sleeve brushed the edge of his console. Tell me you already ran registry. Yes, Commander. And? Jalen pulled the result onto the main glass. No match found. She looked at him. You ran full stack? Local, sector, military, retired bands, colonial archive shadows. Run it again. He had already done that too, but he ran it again because command officers asked for repetition when the first answer had the wrong shape. The relay cross-referenced all known Concord databases, starting with local traffic authority and climbing through naval signatures, private yards, impound logs, heritage museum licenses, and the long dirty basement of history where dead governments and absorbed polities kept their forgotten vessel codes. The search took 21 seconds. No match found. The object was now 6.0 million kilometers out. Ilya braced one hand against the edge of the console and leaned in closer. Drive profile. Jalen opened the burn analysis. The screen filled with comparative bands. Modern civilian signatures in green. Naval classifications in blue. Obsolete patterns in amber. Smuggler modifications in red. Their contact sat in the middle of them all like a hole punched through cloth. Primary result, no active match. Secondary result, partial harmonic correspondence with pre-standard colonial ion spine models. Confidence, 18%. Status note, comparable architectures decommissioned approximately 263 years ago. Jalen heard the door behind them open again. Chief Engineer Rotaz entered muttering that if this was another false spectral reflection he was charging command for sleep theft. Then he saw the main glass and did not finish the sentence. Array check, Ilya said. Ro moved to the secondary board at once. Jalen appreciated that. Good engineers did not waste time being skeptical for performance. They became skeptical with their hands. Outside the forward screens, there was only the reach, thin starlight, dark dust, the long bend of empty space where nothing worth a fleet's attention had happened in 80 years. Border Relay 9 orbited a brown station-keeping rock that served as a navigation mark and little else. No trade hub. No military port. No strategic fuel reserve. If something unknown was coming toward them, then either it was lost beyond reason or it knew exactly what mattered here that no one else did. Ro finished the first diagnostic pass. Arrays clean. Secondary sweep, Ilya said. Jalen triggered the far side dish. The relay's backup sensor bloom reached around the station in a wide cold arc and touched the inbound object from a different angle. The same silver ring appeared. The same black point at its center. The same absence in every known list. Then a soft tone sounded from Jalen's secondary trajectory board. He turned to it and felt the base of his spine go cold. The object had altered course. Not drifted. Not corrected by some fractional navigational wobble. It had changed vector cleanly, decisively, as if something aboard had sensed the relay's attention and answered it. The old projected path would have taken it wide of the station, passing through the outer reach on a silent transit line before vanishing back into black. The new one cut directly toward Border Relay 9. Ilya saw it an instant later. "Was that us?" Ro asked quietly. No one answered because everyone in the room knew it was. The contact crossed 5.8 million kilometers, drive signature steady as breath, and Jalen watched the silver ring around the black point pulse once on the display, as if the system itself were trying and failing to decide what kind of future it had just been asked to measure. By the time command reached the sensor room, the contact had already forced the relay into a condition none of its operating staff had ever seen outside archived simulations. The station had gone from quiet watch to procedural overload in less than 4 minutes. Additional boards woke along the sidewall. Tactical overlays replaced customs traffic. Registry ladders opened across 3 linked displays. Signal scrubbers spun up hard enough to make the floor hum under Jalen's boots. Somewhere overhead, a bulkhead lock sealed with the thick mechanical certainty the Concorde still preferred in systems too close to the frontier for elegance. Commander Trinvale entered at the center of it all with his jacket half-fastened and his expression already arranged into the kind of calm people used when they intended to lend it to the room by force. He was a narrow man, silver beginning at the temples, 27 years in border command, and the sort of officer who treated panic as a species of bad maintenance. Report. Deputy Commander Ilya did not waste time standing straighter than she already was. Unknown contact, archival null classification, inbound under active thrust. Registry negative across local and sector layers. Secondary sweep confirms. Contact altered course after sensor attention. Vale's eyes shifted to Jalen. "You saw the vector change yourself?" "Yes, sir." "Not a software interpolation?" "No, sir." "Good." Not because it was good. Because confirmation was better than confusion. Vale stepped to the main glass. The object still appeared only as a black point wrapped by the thin silver warning ring, but the telemetry fields around it had multiplied. Estimated mass. Heat bloom. Reflective absorption. Drive rhythm. None of it made the point less blank. If anything, more data made the blankness feel aggressive, as if the system was being asked very politely to explain a thing that had no intention of fitting. "Run full Concorde stack," Vale said. Jalen swallowed. "Already in progress, sir." "All layers." "All layers, sir." He pushed the query through again with command priority. The search climbed beyond the sector net this time and reached for Central Concorde Traffic Authority, military hull records, Civil Reserve archives, sanctioned private foundries, scrapped vessel black books, colonial recovery indexes, and the inheritance shadows of absorbed polities whose naming systems still haunted the older database architecture like half-demolished neighborhoods under a modern city. The relay processors gave the search more power than they had ever devoted to any other question in Jalen's time aboard. Rotaz, still at the engineering board, finished his second diagnostic and said, "Sensors are clean. No phantom bloom, no washback, no relay bleed. If it's lying, it isn't us doing it." Vale nodded once. Material red. Jalen threw that pane forward. Hull absorption remained wrong. Not new wrong. Old wrong. The system had found correspondences, but only in brittle museum-depth entries from the chaotic expansion era before shipbuilding standards had hardened into doctrine and doctrine into law. The object's skin drank sensor pings in a way modern hulls did not. It was as if somebody had built a vessel out of assumptions the Concorde had abandoned centuries ago and then kept that vessel alive long enough to cross into the present. Lieutenant Sir Eric from Signals came in still fastening his collar and stopped so abruptly in the doorway that the man behind him nearly walked into his back. "Tell me this is a drill." "No," Ilya said. Sin came over to communications, saw the classification, and said nothing more. The registry search completed. No match found. Not merely no active match. No retired match. No confiscated match. No colonial ghost signature. No allied overlap. No black market harmonic cousin close enough for the system to fake optimism about it. The result block remained brutally short on the center display, an absence so total it looked almost careless. Vale read it once and then said, "Again." No one pointed out that this would be the fourth time. Jalen ran it again anyway. The contact crossed 5.5 million kilometers. Its drive output remained perfectly even, which unnerved him more the longer he looked at it. Machines on long unsupervised runs always developed a little noise. Tiny irregularities. Thermal stutter. Harmonic drift. The object's thrust curve was too smooth for neglect and too alien for familiarity. Could be automated, one of Hess's remote analysts suggested over the open channel from Data Review. Vale did not even look up. Automated systems identify. Not if the registry layer is corrupted. Across Concorde's central, military reserves, and colonial shadow archives simultaneously? Ilya asked. The channel went quiet. Jalen watched the commander's face as he studied the burn profile. Vale was good at stillness, but there were kinds of concentration that made stillness more revealing rather than less. The object was forcing command to think with tools meant for known problems. That was always dangerous. People could become attached to procedure simply because procedure was already in their hands. "Comms," Vale said. Sin straightened at once. "Ready. Hail it." The signal went out on standard Concorde approach bands first. Formal greeting, transit challenge, request for identification, reduction of speed pending registry confirmation. Then on the frontier trade channels. Then on salvage warning frequencies. Then, at Vale's instruction, on 3 retired expansion bands so old the relay had to pull format templates from archive memory and rewrite them into machine-readable packets before transmission. Nothing came back. No acknowledgement pulse. No collision avoidance. No request for translation layering. No angry response from some lost captain offended by border procedure. Just the same steady approach, now 5.2 million kilometers out. Sin looked over from comms. "It's hearing us." "How do you know?" "Because it changed for the sensors," Sin said. "If it can feel a scan, it can hear a hail." No one argued with that. Then the main tactical pane updated again. The object had adjusted its course a second time. Smaller now. Finer. Not toward the relay itself this time, but toward the station's command spindle, the one section of Border Relay 9 that actually mattered if a vessel intended to disable response rather than merely approach infrastructure. Jalen felt his mouth go dry. "It's selecting," Ilya said. Commander Vale did not answer for a long second. Then he said, very calmly, "Bring defense grid to pre-arming status. Do not light it yet. Keep hailing. And someone get me historical language support." Jalen looked at the black point at the center of the silver ring and understood, with the peculiar cold clarity that sometimes arrived before fear finished forming, that every tool the Concorde had built for strangers assumed strangers wanted entrance, trade, passage, or war. Nothing on his screen looked like it wanted any of those things. It looked like it had come expecting to find them unready. Historical language support turned out to be one man, half awake, carried into the sensor room on the authority of Commander Vale's voice and the old emergency codes nobody liked using because they always sounded melodramatic right up until the moment they weren't. Archivist Pell arrived in station slippers under a formal records coat, hair flattened on one side from sleep, one hand still gripping the portable case he used for handling pre-standard media. He was older than almost everyone in the room by 20 years and looked, Jalen thought, less alarmed by the silver-ringed contact than by the fact that someone had made him leave the archive stacks before dawn. What exactly, Pell asked, setting the case down on the nearest auxiliary console, requires linguistic retrieval at this hour? Sin answered without looking away from the comm board. Unknown vessel. Non-response on modern channels. Commander wants deadband capability. Pell's expression changed by a degree so slight Jalen might have missed it if he had not been looking for any human signal that matched what his own nerves were doing. Deadbands? Pell said quietly. How old? Jalen threw the retired frequency list to the side panel. Pell read it once and then opened the case. Inside were adapters, interface tongues, archive bridges, the little physical ghosts of communication eras the Concorde no longer used but had never quite dared to destroy. He selected two by touch alone, as if his fingers knew the shapes better than thought did, and handed one to Sin. This one first, he said. Expansion-era trade standard carried through fringe settlements. If they're old enough to be using legacy hardware, they may still recognize the signal frame even if the spoken layer shifted. Sin stared at the connector. We still have a port for this? No, Pell said. That is why I brought the other thing. The room made space for him then, not ceremonially, just with the small quick movements people made around competence when competence had become more valuable than rank. Sen patched the first adapter into the comm spine with Ro assisting from engineering because the relay's modern sockets had to be persuaded, rather than instructed, to remember certain old protocols. Pell stood over them both and dictated the handshake sequence from memory. While they worked, the unknown vessel crossed 4.9 million kilometers. Still steady. Still under active thrust. Still holding that clean, impossible certainty as if every meter it closed had been imagined long ago and was now merely being completed. Commander Vale kept hailing. Standard challenge. Order request. Transit warning. Collision authority. Open language formats. Mathematical pulse. Binary scaffolds. Nothing. The room had stopped suggesting alternate explanations. Jalen noticed that before he fully noticed the silence itself. No one was saying sensor fault anymore. No one was saying drift. The relay had crossed out those hopes one by one and left them with the harder labor of taking reality seriously. The deadband bridge came online with a low click from Sen's board. Pell leaned over the microphone input and said, "Send this first in signal architecture only. No speech. Let them hear the bones of the thing before the words arrive." Sen glanced at Vale. Vale nodded once. The pulse went out, not like modern compressed comms but slower, wider, carrying a shape older than Jalen's training. Even without understanding it, he could hear the difference through the monitor speakers. Modern traffic was efficient because it assumed mutual frameworks. This sounded like something built for distance, caution, and the possibility that whoever listened might never have heard another mind through a machine before. They waited. At 4.7 million kilometers, the comm board lit white. Every head in the room turned. Not red. Not alert priority. White, which in the relay's old inherited coding meant inbound carrier on an unclassified band. Sen's hands moved at once. We have a response. Jalen looked to the range pane. The vessel had not changed speed. Audio? Vale asked. Sen shook his head. Carrier only. It's old. Pell was already reaching into his case again. Route it through the archive filter. Do not let the modern translation layer touch it raw or it'll chew the phonetic edges off. Can it do that? Yes, Pell said. Frequently. Another adapter. Another handshake. Another set of prompts so old the relay had to pause between each as if consulting buried instinct. The white light on the board held steady. For 11 long seconds nothing audible came through. Then the speakers filled with a low wash of carrier static and, beneath it, a voice. Not clear. Not distorted, exactly. A voice traveling through scaffolds the station had not been built to welcome, shaped by a language close enough to something the archive still remembered that the translation engine dared an answer and uncertain enough that the answer arrived in fragments. Language family, Expansion trade route. Variant divergence, high. Confidence, 63%. Jalen had never seen translation confidence that low for a live speaker. The voice continued for 7 seconds. The station rendered 5 words. Registry, empty, recognized, we know. No one in the room breathed. The voice stopped. The translation engine reprocessed, then corrected itself and offered a slightly different arrangement. Registry known to be empty. We know. Sin stared at the text as though staring harder might make the confidence rise. Pell did not look surprised. He looked older. It's a descendant dialect, he said softly. Not a relic. It grew. Jalen knew what he meant at once, and wishing he did not know changed nothing. Languages only grew away from each other like that when they lived apart for a very long time. Not preserved in museums. Spoken. Changed in the mouths of children who became grandparents and were answered by voices that had never once needed outside permission to mean what they meant. Commander Vale stepped to the mic. This is Border Relay 9 under Concord Authority, he said, slower now, shaping each word so the old band filters could carry it cleanly. Unknown vessel, identify yourself and reduce approach speed. The silence that followed was not empty. Jalen could feel that now. The way the contact held itself just beyond understanding was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a thing measuring a room before deciding what the room deserved. Then the speakers answered again. Longer this time. The translation engine caught more, stumbled twice, corrected once, and laid the words out in a narrow column on the side screen. We are aware of your authority claim. We acknowledge your signal. Approach continues. The room processed that in stillness. Continues. Sin repeated. Pell did not take his eyes off the text. That is what it says. Commander Vale's voice remained level by a discipline Jalen suddenly admired more than he had ever admired command before. You are approaching a Concord installation without clearance. The answer came back almost at once, as if the speaker had expected the line before Vale finished giving it. Clearance is not the question under review. Jalen felt his stomach turn over once, slowly. The vessel crossed 4.5 million kilometers. On the main pane, the silver ring pulsed around the black point again, faint as breath. Jalen found himself staring at it and thinking that the most frightening part of the exchange was not that the unknown vessel understood them. It was that it seemed to understand the structure of refusal well enough to step around it. Pell leaned nearer the translation stream. Whoever is speaking, he murmured, not quite to anyone, has done this before. Vale heard him anyway. Can you tell from what? Pell looked at the text. Then at the contact. Then back to the text. Because they are not searching for words, he said. They came with them ready. Commander Vale changed tactics without announcing he was doing it. Jalen noticed because the commander stopped speaking like a border officer and started speaking like a man trying to cross a bridge that might only exist on the other side. What should we call you? Vale asked. It was not protocol. Protocol demanded classification, registry, intent, authority. Names came later, after the system had decided what drawer you belonged in. The room knew that. No one commented on it. The reply took longer this time. Not because the speaker seemed confused. Because, Jalen thought, whoever sat on the other side of that ancient channel was deciding whether the room had earned the shape of an answer. When the voice came, it was clearer than before. The translation confidence climbed to 71%, then hesitated there. Call this vessel the Wayfarer Patience. No one in the room said anything for several seconds. Not because the answer was threatening. Because it was not. A ship called Patience crossing empty dark toward a forgotten border relay on hardware old enough to confuse modern systems was somehow more unnerving than a vessel named for conquest would have been. Conquest was legible. You built fleets, laws, and doctrines around conquest. Patience meant something else. Something slower. Something that had already lived longer than panic. Vale's expression did not alter, but Jalen saw Ilya's eyes shift slightly at the word. She had heard it too, the shape underneath the sound. Patience, Vale repeated into the mic, pronouncing it carefully enough that the ancient band filters could carry the syllables intact. I am Commander Turin Vale of Border Relay 9. You are in approach to Concord-controlled space. I need to understand why you are here. Carrier hiss. Then the voice again. Because this is where the record remains open. Jalen looked at Pell. The archivist had gone very still beside the translation screen. Not tense. Listening with his whole age. What record? Vale asked. The answer came back in the same calm measure. The record of our removal. The record of your silence. The record of whether either has changed. No one moved. Jalen watched the contact range tick down another fraction. 4.3 million kilometers. Still that steady impossible thrust. Still no flare of hostility. No weapons bloom. No aggressive broadcast burst. Only approach. Sen was already routing the audio through a deeper archive model, feeding the system more examples from expansion trade syntax trees and old settlement phoneme shifts. The confidence meter climbed again, slowly now, like something thawing. Commander Vale rested 2 fingers against the edge of the console and asked, "Who are we?" Again the pause. Jalen realized then that pauses had become their own language in the room. This speaker was not hesitating. Hesitation belonged to uncertainty. These silences belonged to selection. At last the answer came. We are the inheritors of an erased designation. We are the descendants of those not entered. We are those who continued. The last line appeared 3 different ways as the engine struggled with it. We remained. We endured. We continued. Pell reached out and manually fixed the 3rd rendering in place. That one, he said softly. Keep that one. Vale heard him, absorbed it, and went on. If you were erased by whom? This time the silence was longer. Rotaz shifted his weight at the engineering board. Sen's hand hovered over the comm gain. Jalen became aware of the station around them again in fragments. The filtered air, the low engine hum from the relay's orbit correction systems, the faint scent of overheated circuits from a room using more of itself than it had expected to before dawn. Then the voice returned. By the same structure that now claims authority over this station. By older names carried forward into newer ones. By decision, not accident. That landed in the room like a pressure change. No one said the obvious thing out loud, not yet. It was too large to say cleanly on first touch. But Jalen could feel the line of thought forming anyway. Not disaster. Not disappearance. Decision. Vale's voice remained steady, but Jalen had been listening to him for years and knew now when steadiness was work. If you have a grievance with the Concord, there are formal avenues. The reply cut in before he finished. Not rudely. Precisely. Avenues require standing. Standing requires recognition. Recognition was removed. Translation confidence jumped to 79%. Jalen stared at the words. They did not sound like the language of raiders or zealots or survivors arriving in desperation. They sounded prepared in a way that made preparation itself feel like leverage. Ilya leaned slightly toward Vale. Not enough to interrupt the transmission. Enough to remind him he was not standing alone inside it. Vale adjusted by a degree. You said this record remains open, he said. How long have you been attempting contact? The answer came without a pause this time. In formal registry terms, 109 standard years. In inherited intention, much longer. Jalen blinked. Sen actually looked away from his board for the first time since the white carrier light had appeared. 109, he said under his breath. Pell closed his eyes briefly, as if setting a weight onto an older shelf in his mind. Vale said, You've been trying to contact Concord systems for 109 years? Checking, the voice corrected. Measuring whether the registry remained empty. Recording each answer. Each answer. Jalen felt cold move up through his arms. That was not just patience. That was methodology. Somewhere, for more than a century, people had been sending queries into Concord space expecting silence and writing the silence down. Not hoping. Not pleading. Documenting. Why not come sooner? Vale asked. A faint crackle moved through the carrier, and for the first time Jalen heard something almost like texture in the voice on the other side. Not emotion exactly. The edge of something too old to spend itself cheaply. Arrival without readiness produces waste. We chose not to waste this. The engine offered alternate renderings again. We chose not to spend this badly. We chose not to arrive unprepared. Pell selected the second and locked it in. The contact crossed 4.0 million kilometers. Still coming. Still under perfect thrust. Vale looked at the trajectory pane, then back to the comm text. Prepared for what? The answer arrived so quickly it felt like truth rather than response. For denial. For acknowledgement. For both. Jalen did not realize he had stopped breathing until his chest started hurting. There was no grandness in any of it. That was the worst part. The speaker on the other side was not performing revelation. They were speaking like someone finishing an inventory. Commander Vale studied the translation stream for a long moment. Then he asked the question Jalen had been dreading without knowing why. Where did you come from? The silence that followed was the deepest yet. Not hostile. Measured. Then a data burst arrived alongside the voice. Sen swore softly and caught it before the aging protocol layer could misfile it as noise. Coordinates unfolded across the side screen in an outdated spatial notation the relay's modern NAV suite had to translate twice before it understood what it was seeing. Pell made a small involuntary sound. Jalen turned toward him. You know them? The archivist did not answer at once. His eyes were fixed on the coordinate block as if something very old had just lifted its head in the dark and looked directly back at him. Vale asked the question for him. Archivist. Pell opened his mouth, closed it, then said, very quietly, those are not uncharted coordinates. The room tightened. What are they? Ilya asked. Pell kept staring. They are Survey-era colonial marks, he said. Very old. Pre-standard. They would have belonged to one of the first expansion clusters on the far border before the Concord inherited the sector maps. Jalen looked back at the coordinate string and felt, with sudden certainty, the shape of the next question before anyone spoke it. Commander Vale asked it anyway. What happened to that cluster? Pell's gaze remained on the screen. I don't know, he said. And then, after a pause that made it worse rather than better. But I think the archive does. Archivist Pell left the sensor room with Commander Vale's authority riding behind him like a draft of cold air. He did not hurry at first. Hurry was for people who believed speed could replace method. Pell had spent 32 years in the Concord Record Service and 12 more before that in apprentice cataloging, which meant he had lived most of his useful life among things that only yielded cleanly when approached in the right order. Men with guns ran toward danger. Archivists walked toward locks. That lasted until the first archive gate refused him. The records vault lay 3 decks below the relay's command spindle behind a pressure door that had not been sealed in earnest since a microfire in the indexing room 20 years earlier. Pell keyed his clearance, spoke the emergency phrase Commander Vale had given him, and waited while the old gate compared his face to a personnel file taken when his hair had been darker and his shoulders less careful. The gate admitted him reluctantly. Inside, the archive was as it had always been, cool, dim, faintly metallic, with shelves of physical carry cases lining the walls behind glass and the central retrieval columns glowing in patient vertical rows. Pell loved the room more than he loved almost any person still alive, which was not a confession he would have made aloud if threatened. He set his portable case on the nearest console and entered the coordinates the unknown vessel had transmitted. The archive paused. That, more than any spoken alarm, made his pulse change. Modern files returned quickly. Even deeply restricted ones moved with the oiled confidence of systems designed by people who assumed the future would always be searchable. Old files behaved differently. They hesitated. They sorted through inherited categorizations, retired filing grammars, and the sediment of collapsed administrations. A pause meant depth. The result tree opened in layers. Survey corridor, outer expansion. Colonial cluster references. Administrative partitions set retired. Primary designation unavailable. Related material under seal. Pell stared at the last line. Seal classes were not uncommon. Sensitive military inventories, diplomatic blood rights cases, intelligence harvests from the war years. But there were shapes to normal secrecy. Recent dates. Living committees. Current codes. This looked like none of those. He opened the metadata. Seal age, 301 standard years. Original authority chain, superseded. Review history, none. Declassification motion, none. Cross-index visibility, restricted to omission state. Omission state, Pell said aloud, and did not like how thin his own voice sounded in the room. Omission state was an old term. Very old. It predated Concord consolidation and belonged to the harsher vocabulary of expansion administration, when governments believed that if a thing became inconvenient enough, it could be managed by teaching the official world not to see it. He requested the file. The archive refused him. Not loudly. Just with an unemotional block of text listing insufficient authority, outdated supervisory signatures, and the requirement for command concurrence on any seal maintained under omission law. Pell looked at the screen. Then he opened the command channel and called Commander Vale back in the sensor room. Vale answered at once. Yes. I found the cluster file. And? It's real. It's sealed under omission state. Silence, brief and dangerous. Meaning someone didn't classify it for privacy, Commander. Someone classified it for disappearance. Another short silence. Pell imagined Vale reading that against the silver-ringed contact still moving through the dark. You have command concurrence, Vale said. That gives me the outer shell. Take the shell. Pell ended the call and fed the concurrence into the vault. The first layer came away. He expected incident reports, geological surveys, loss notices. Instead, the archive opened with an expansion-era colonial prospectus, so old it still used margin annotations rather than linked references. Coordinates. Atmospheric profile. Resource viability. Settlement recommendation. Below that, a species survey. Pell leaned closer. Native or established intelligent population present. Yes. Designation class. Pre-contact, independent development. Local self-identification groups, multiple. Recommended umbrella registry term pending standardization, terrene. Subclassification notes appended. Not human. Not yet. The term had not settled at this stage. That mattered less than the next lines. Population spread, 14 active settlements. Technological profile, rapidly adaptive. Strategic recommendation, continued observation prior to integration decision. Pell's fingers remained still over the console. 14 settlements. He opened the appendices. Language notes. Trade behavior. Early cultural summaries written in that strange polite arrogance old surveyors often used when they believed themselves to be objective while measuring people for use. The survey teams had found the population resilient, inventive, difficult to predict under stress. At the bottom of one supplemental page, a junior notator had added a side observation in low-priority clerical script. Subjects demonstrate continuity behavior beyond expected post-disruption norms. Record retention appears culturally reinforced. Pell sat back slowly. Continuity behavior. Record retention. He thought of the voice on the deadband frequency saying, "We know your archive is empty. We have the records." He requested the next linked file. This time the archive opened it. Administrative actions set K, 17/black. Originating office, redacted. Authority chain, redacted. Disposition rationale, redacted. The body of the order had been struck through so thoroughly by old omission sensors that the page looked wounded. Whole paragraphs gone. Signatures gone. Decision trail gone. But seals were bureaucratic things, and bureaucracies often preserved their skeletons even when they hid the meat. Enough remained. Registry recommendation. Designation withdrawn pending action completion. Navigation references to cluster set, scheduled for burial under hazard notation. Future appearance in census and fleet access logs, disallowed. Residual contact reports after effective date, to be routed under incident coding, not species coding. Pell read that section 3 times. Not extermination language. Not openly. Worse, in some ways. Language meant to make removal look administrative. As if a people could be turned into a filing error and then disposed of through the calm obedience of systems. His mouth had gone dry. He searched for the effective date and found it not in the body, where omission sensors had done their work thoroughly, but in the file version chain the redactors had not thought to collapse. Pell smiled once then, humorless and professional. Redactors always forgot that archivists read edges as carefully as centers. He translated the version dates into modern standard. Then he opened the next linked record. Cluster status update. Transmission irregularities reported. Supply routes suspended. Investigation pending. Date: 11 years after K-17/Black came into force. Pell felt the shape of it before he reached the final report. Investigation outcome summary. Cause of settlement silence, stellar instability event. Survivor count, none confirmed. Further action, none required. 3 lines. 3 bloodless, efficient lines where there should have been inquiry trees, salvage logs, thermal records, distress relays, burial notices, at least 40 pages of ordinary official grief. Pell had archived genuine colony losses before. Real disasters spilled paperwork. They generated panic, requisitions, blame, cost accounting, memorial disputes, replacement traffic motions, insurance conflicts. Real tragedies were messy in the record because the living had to step over them. This report was clean. Too clean. He cross-referenced the coordinates the unknown vessel had transmitted. The match returned absolute. Origin point, former Cluster 7. Current official map state, uninhabited remnant hazard zone. Underlying archive state, omitted settlement history present. Pell closed his eyes for one moment only. When he opened them again, he assembled the chain the way an archivist must, not as accusation, but as sequence. Survey of an inhabited people. Administrative removal from registry. Burial of navigational identity. 11 years. Then a minimalist disaster fiction to close the door. He built the packet carefully, attaching the unsealed survey pages, the version chain dating evidence, the omission state order fragments, the absurd 3-line incident closure, and finally the coordinate match tying all of it to the vessel now approaching border relay 9 under perfect thrust. At the top of the report he wrote, "Available archive evidence indicates that the population associated with the transmitted coordinates was not lost first and erased afterward. It was administratively erased first and reported lost afterward." He read the sentence once. Adjusted nothing. Then he sent it to Commander Vale, Deputy Commander Ilya, and Command Review under immediate emergency authority. The vault remained quiet around him. Pell stood there with one hand resting on the cool edge of the console and thought, not for the first time in his career, that there were forms of murder so ashamed of themselves they dressed as paperwork. Above him, millions of kilometers closer than it had been an hour ago, a ship named Wayfarer Patience continued its approach. And now the archive, dragged at last into honesty, had given the room upstairs the one truth it would not be able to unknow. The Concorde had not failed to remember those people. It had chosen not to. The archive packet reached the sensor room 6 minutes after Pell sent it. Commander Vale read it standing up. Jalen knew because Vale had been seated for the last 20 minutes without seeming to be seated, one hand flat against the edge of the command console, eyes on the translation stream, body arranged in that temporary stillness experienced officers used when they were waiting for information and refusing to admit they needed it. Then the packet arrived, Vale opened it, read the first paragraph, and rose all the way to his feet as if the act had happened somewhere below thought. Deputy Commander Ilya read over his shoulder. Jalen watched both of them without meaning to. It felt impolite and unavoidable. Neither spoke until Vale reached the final line. Administratively erased first. Reported lost afterward. The words sat on the command glass like something physical. Sen at Communications did not turn from his board. "Commander!" Vale looked up as though the room had come back into existence around him by stages. "Open the channel," he said. The old band link to the Wayfarer Patience was still live. Carrier Hiss breathed softly through the relay speakers. The vessel had closed another fraction in the time it took to read the archive packet. 3.6 million kilometers now, still under the same calm exact thrust, still not behaving like anything that wanted permission from the present to complete something begun in the past. Vale keyed the mic. "Wayfarer Patience, this is Commander Vale. We have reviewed archive evidence tied to the coordinates you transmitted." The answer came almost immediately. Nothing else. Not because more could not have been said. Because more was not necessary. Vale looked once at the packet again, then at the trajectory pane, then back to the comm board. "I believe you should come aboard this station," he said. The silence that followed was very brief, but Jalen felt everyone in the room enter it with their full attention. The shape of the day had changed. An hour ago they had been trying to classify a problem. Now command was inviting history through an airlock. At last the voice from the patients replied. "That is acceptable." Jalen heard Ro-Taz exhale through his nose like someone who had been waiting for a warning that still had not come and was not sure that was better. Vale continued. "You will dock under station guidance. No weapons declarations pending. No armed escort from your side." The answer came back with the same measured clarity the translation engine had now learned well enough to render at 89%. "We can accommodate your theater." Jalen looked at Senator Sun, looked at the text, and then deliberately did not look at anyone else. Commander Vale let the line hang for 1 second. Then he said, "And from your side?" The pause. "We will arrive with record, not force." That, Jalen thought, was the kind of sentence people spent generations becoming able to say without drama. The docking request came through 9 minutes later in a protocol frame, so old the station had to unseal one of its buried compatibility routines to interpret it. Not a military challenge shape. Not civilian traffic either. Something older than both, from an era when ships did not assume stations understood them and asked instead to be taught the shape of local entry. Ro-Taz oversaw the handshake personally because engineering had become inseparable from diplomacy somewhere around the moment history started speaking on a dead frequency. "It's like teaching an old lock a new building," he muttered while guiding the interface. "Everything still works. It just resents the assumptions." The patients did not approach for docking. Instead, at 3.2 million kilometers, it stopped with a precision so exact the navigation board printed a stability caution on reflex, as if no vessel ought to be able to hold itself that still without provoking physics into complaint. Then a smaller craft detached from the ventral spine and turned toward border relay 9 under controlled thrust. Jalen saw it first on the sideboard and called it before anyone asked. Secondary launch. 1 shuttle. Mass low. No weapons bloom. Commander Vale nodded once. "Receive it." The station began preparing as stations always did when they were frightened and pretending fear was procedure. Security teams moved to docking Ring C because it was the easiest bay to isolate and the least dignified, which made it tactically preferable. Med support was placed 2 corridors back. Diplomatic protocol woke itself in layers and tried very hard to catch up with reality. Someone from Central Command sent a message marked priority instructing Vale to delay any substantive exchange until a full review committee could convene. Vale read it, marked it received, and did not alter docking operations by a single second. Jalen appreciated that more than he expected. By the time the shuttle crossed final guidance range, Pell had come back up from the archive. He looked as if the vault had taken something from him and replaced it with a narrower, harder shape. He carried a slim physical folder in one hand, old printouts under a clear shield, and when Jalen glanced at the top page he saw the Survey-era designation again. Terrene. Not human. Not yet. A name before a name. "You should rest," Ilya said quietly as Pell came to stand near the command rail. Pell shook his head without looking at her. "Not while the file is walking." The shuttle touched Dock C with less vibration than most courier skiffs. The guidance board chimed green. Atmosphere compatibility matched within safe ranges. No concealed drive bloom. No hostile emissions. No surprises that any system could measure. Commander Vale left the sensor room then, taking Ilya, Pell, 2 security officers, and 1 diplomatic clerk with him. Before the door closed behind them, he looked back once toward Jalen. "You stay on contact." "Yes, sir." "If the patience moves, I call it before the system does." Vale nodded and was gone. The docking cam came up on Jalen's side screen automatically, small beside the larger telemetry displays. He watched the shuttle settle into the bay cradle as clamps took hold around landing struts built in a style that modern manufacture had abandoned 2 centuries earlier. The hull plating was matte and worn, not neglected, but touched by long use and repeated care. This was not a museum piece. It was what remained when something old had never been allowed to become past. The outer hatch cycled. 3 figures emerged. The one at the center carried no visible rank markers. Plain dark outerwear. Close-fitted working gloves tucked into a belt rather than worn. Hair bound back simply. Nothing about the figure asked the station to admire them. That, more than any insignia could have, drew the eye. Jalen watched Commander Vale meet them at the line painted across the bay floor where station custody formally began. Vale said something the bay mics did not catch. The figure in front listened, then inclined their head once and answered. Pell, standing half a step behind Vale, stiffened at the first sound of the voice. It was not because he recognized the person. It was because he recognized the cadence. The same voice that had crossed deadband carrier from the dark. The same deliberate shape to each word. The same patience. The figure removed one hand from the side of a narrow black case and set the case gently on the bay floor between them. Not handed over. Not guarded. Please. Jalen could not hear the words, but he saw the translation caption feed from the bay mics catch up a second later. I am Leo NIT of the 7th Continuance. I have come to correct the record with you in person. No one in Dock C moved for a long second after that. Then Commander Vale stepped aside from the painted custody line and said, with the visible care of a man choosing not merely words but the century they would belong to afterward. Come in. The station's diplomatic room had been designed by people who believed neutrality could be manufactured through furniture. The walls were a careful gray. The table was long enough to suggest seriousness and narrow enough to discourage open hostility. The lighting came from recessed strips that softened every face just enough to make hard decisions look discussable. On one wall hung the Concord seal in brushed metal, all rings and stars and layered authority. Pell noticed Leo and look at it exactly once while entering the room, and in that glance he saw no awe, no anger, not even contempt. Only recognition. That was worse. Commander Vale took the seat at the near side of the table. Deputy Commander Ilya sat to his right, the diplomatic clerk to his left, fingers already poised over a transcript pad. Pell chose the far corner where records officers always ended up in rooms like this, close enough to be useful, distant enough to be ignored until truth required a witness. Leo and he did not wait to be assigned a chair. They crossed to the opposite side of the table and sat with the black case resting beside one foot, posture relaxed in the way of someone who had long ago stopped confusing relaxation with vulnerability. 2 others had come with them from the shuttle, younger by appearance, though Pell had become cautious about assigning age too quickly to people who descended from archives rather than assumptions. One remained near the door. The other sat half a pace behind Leo with a tablet of some old dark material resting idle across both knees. No one on the continuance side appeared armed. Pell found that fact profoundly unhelpful. Commander Vale began with the kind of sentence institutions preferred when they sensed they were no longer setting the shape of the conversation. For the record, state your identity and authority. Leo folded their hands lightly on the table. For your record, they said, I am Leo ANIT, appointed speaker for the 7th Continuance Vessel Group and designated representative under Remnant Charter for direct contact with Concord administrative structures. The translation support in the room had no trouble with their speech now. The archive language models had adapted quickly once given a live voice and enough examples. That too unsettled Pell. The gap between then and now had not vanished. It had merely become translatable. Vale inclined his head once. And the purpose of your arrival? Leo looked at him for so long that Pell felt the silence becoming its own answer before the words came. Restoration. Nothing in the room moved. Not because the word was unclear. Because it was. Leo reached down, drew the black case upright, and opened it on the table with both latches released in one deliberate motion. Inside lay paper. Not a symbolic sheet or two. Not a ceremonial token from a vanished tradition. A layered stack of physical documents held flat beneath clear shielding, each one protected, indexed, and worn at the edges in ways no newly printed archive ever was. Pell leaned forward despite himself. He knew paper. He knew long-kept things. These had been handled, copied, compared, carried. not treasured into uselessness. Used. Leo removed the first document and placed it at the center of the table. We brought several records, they said. This one is the short form. The diplomatic clerk glanced at Vale, then at the page, then began to read. Pell did not wait. He was already standing, already moving around the side of the table with a muttered apology no one heard. The page was written in a dual-column hand. One column in a script grown from old expansion trade, the other in a clean Concord-readable transliteration that had obviously been prepared before the shuttle ever left the patients. It was not a speech. It was a list. Pell felt, with immediate professional admiration and personal dread, how dangerous that was. The first item was only one line long. Restore active registry recognition to the erased population designated in Survey-era files as Terrene and in surviving internal continuity records as human. The second item followed beneath it. Open and declassify all omission state administrative actions relating to cluster removals under outer expansion policy, beginning with case K-17/Black and linked derivative closures. The third. Issue formal public correction to all active Concord archives establishing that lost designation was administrative fiction layered over living continuity. The fourth. Provide standing representation in all future deliberative bodies whose decisions affect routes, worlds, and populations previously denied registry existence. That was all. No compensation schedules. No territorial claims. No military guarantees. No revenge dressed as legal language. Pell read the list twice. He could feel Commander Vale reading it too, not with his eyes now but with the slower part of a man measuring consequences against the pressure they would place on structures too large to move quickly and too compromised to stay still. Vale was the first to speak. You crossed the reach with a vessel outside Concord law, he said carefully. You approached a military relay without clearance. You may understand that some would expect demands of a different kind. Leo's gaze did not shift. We understand very well what some would expect. And these are not those demands. No. Why? For the first time something almost like tiredness touched Leo's face. Not weakness. Not hesitation. The shadow of an old calculation done too many times to require emotion anymore. Because what was taken first was not territory, they said. It was reality. The words landed in the room with the simple weight of something that had no need to sound dramatic because it was true. Leo rested one hand on the top sheet. Land can be left. Settlements can be destroyed. Fleets can be rebuilt. Those are losses with visible shapes. What was done to us was quieter. Your structure removed our designation. It taught its own systems to return empty when asked for us. It buried routes, renamed absences, turned decision into accident. For 3 centuries your official world has behaved as if we were not one of the possible things in it. Pell sat back down very slowly. The clerk had stopped typing for 2 full seconds and only resumed when Ilya touched the edge of the transcript pad with one finger. Commander Vale said, "You are asking for entry into Concord governance." Leo shook their head once. "No. We are informing you that governance built over erased populations is incomplete if it continues without them." That was a better sentence than the room deserved. Vale's eyes dropped again to the page. "You ask nothing else. We ask nothing extraneous. Some in command will read that as restraint. They may read it however they like. And if command refuses?" Pell had known the question would come. Institutions always reached for the fantasy of refusal, even after evidence had made refusal expensive. It was one of the ways they reassured themselves that choice still existed in its old shape. Leo did not answer at once. Their fingers moved to the next sheet in the stack and drew it free. Pell saw what it was before anyone else in the room did. A registry query log. Page after page of dated entries. Concord archive access attempts. Border traffic calls. Census layer probes. Recognition tests. One every standard interval, then another and another and another, stretching backward through years until the ink itself changed character and the formatting shifted with generations of hands. Leo laid the first of the logs atop the demands list. "We began formal verification 109 years ago," they said. "Every answer was empty. We recorded each one. We taught the record forward. When one generation died, the next continued the checks. Refusal is not a new condition to us, Commander. It is a measured one. No one in the room moved. Pell stared at the pages, at the dates, at the terrible discipline of it. 1 century of asking a dead system whether it still denied you, not because hope required it, but because evidence did. Vale's voice had gone quieter by the time he asked, "What happens if it remains measured?" Leo looked at him, and Pell saw then what had been unsettling him since Doc C. There was no threat in that face because threat required desire to frighten. This was something colder and cleaner. A people who had spent too long preparing to spend effort on intimidation. What happens, Leo said, is that the record remains open. They let that sit between them. Then, with almost unbearable calm, they added, "And we continue." Commander Vale's report took 3 hours to write and less than 8 minutes to become the most restricted document in the Concord. He wrote it in the Relay's command office with Pell on one side of the desk and Ilya on the other, the three of them speaking only when a line needed to be sharpened until it could bear the weight being put on it. Vale handled the operational sections himself. Contact emergence. Registry failure. Deadband response. Approach pattern. Shuttle arrival. The demand list. Pell handled the archival chain, reducing 3 centuries of omission law, false closure, and curated absence into a sequence so clean it could not be argued with honestly. Ilya wrote the thread appendix and crossed half of it out before anyone saw it, because every ordinary category felt like an act of cowardice in the face of what they were actually measuring. At the top of the report, Vale entered the only summary line that still seemed true after revision. Administrative erasure event confirmed. Descendant continuity active. Contact peaceful. Demands limited. Consequence of refusal indeterminate. The capital called for immediate review. The chamber where the review took place had been built when the Concord still thought permanence could be designed into a ceiling. It was not as large as the grand legislative hall above it, but it had inherited the same instincts. Stone-colored walls. Tiered seating. A central speaking floor under narrow light shafts angled to make everyone standing there feel exposed and everyone seated feel entitled to judgment. The effect was deliberate. Concord governance liked rooms that turned thought into posture. Vale stood on the speaking floor 2 hours after his shuttle reached the Capitol ring and delivered the report without embellishment. He read the contact chronology first. The silver-ringed null state. The registry failures. The old communication band. The coordinates. The archive findings. Then the in-person meeting. Leo A.N.I.T.'s language. The paper records. The 4 demands laid down without softening and without escalation. He did not dramatize the line about reality being taken first. He did not need to. The room knew where to feel its own pulse. When he finished, there was no immediate questioning. Only the small dry sound of records pads updating around the chamber and the much more human sound of powerful people recalculating themselves under unfavorable light. Counselor Marrow Tane spoke first. Tane represented the interior security block and had built his career on the proposition that every unknown thing became less dangerous if you talked about it loudly enough in military terms. He was broad-shouldered, iron gray, and still sat as if every chair beneath him had been assigned by rank. "This body cannot reward pressure," he said. "A vessel appears out of omitted space, enters frontier jurisdiction without clearance, surrounds a relay with massed support positions, and presents demands under implied duress. If we ratify this behavior, we create precedent for every grievance population in mapped space." Pell, seated 3 rows behind Vale as archival witness, almost smiled. There was. The first refuge of institutions under moral strain. Precedent. Counselor Neve Sarin, who headed procedural review, raised 2 fingers for recognition. The phrase grievance population, she said, assumes the grievance is under dispute. The report does not suggest dispute. Tane turned toward her with controlled impatience. The report suggests contact conditions under coercive asymmetry. "Everything important," Sarin said, "occurs under some kind of asymmetry." A few people in the chamber looked away then, which in Concord politics was the equivalent of a wince. Tane pressed on. The seat request alone should be enough for refusal. Registry restoration can be discussed. Archive review can be discussed. Public acknowledgement can be negotiated into less inflammatory language. But representation? Voting standing? Based on one ship, one file chain, and the word of descendants who admit they have spent a century preparing leverage. Vale did not move. He had already given his report. Officers who started debating from the floor turned themselves into politicians and then lost both professions at once. Counselor Demi Voss asked for recognition next, a compact woman from the Civic Law Ministry whose talent lay in sounding reasonable while moving a blade. A middle path exists, she said. We could provisionally restore active designation, open a supervised review of omission state files, and offer observership in the outer deliberative councils pending full historical adjudication. That would acknowledge continuity without surrendering chamber parity to a group whose scale, territorial standing, and strategic capacity remain unclear. That gathered more support in posture than speech. Pell could see it immediately. Heads inclined. Padslit. Silent alignment. Not cruelty exactly. The older instinct. Give enough that the ledger of appearances improves while preserving the structure that produced the injury. Vale thought, not for the first time, of Leo Nit's face when they said they had not come to ask for extraneous things. He suspected they would recognize this middle path for what it was before the sentence proposing it reached the period. Counselor Issa Ren of the Academic Cartography Circle requested the floor and received it more quickly than Tane liked. Ren was older than most of the chamber and indifferent to being agreeable. Her work concerned star routes, erased corridors, and the habit empires had of pretending their maps were objective rather than victorious. Pell had liked her from a distance for years, which was as close to affection as the records profession often came. I would like, Ren said, to separate two errors currently being committed at once. The chamber settled. She had that kind of voice. Not loud. Already obeyed. First, the error of scale. This is not one ship. Commander Vale's report confirms one visible vessel, one shuttle, and multiple massed support positions deployed with tactical literacy superior to our own assumptions. We may call that uncertainty if uncertainty comforts us. It does not make the structure smaller. She let that stand, then continued. Second, the error of generosity. Several of you are speaking as though active designation and representational standing are concessions we might choose to bestow. They are not. If the archive chain is accurate, and I find no serious argument in this room that it is not, then those conditions were removed by administrative fraud. Restoration is not a gift. It is repair. That moved through the chamber harder than Tane's warnings had. Not because everyone agreed. Because everyone understood the sentence would survive outside the room. Tane leaned forward. And if there are others? Ren turned her head slightly toward him. Others what? Others omitted. Others prepared. Others waiting for us to validate similar claims. Ren's answer came without haste. Then reality is already larger than our registry, Counselor. Refusal will not reduce it. No one spoke after that for several seconds. Pell used the quiet to watch faces. Some frightened. Some annoyed. Some, most dangerously, relieved to have heard the truth from someone old enough to survive saying it first. Counselor Voss attempted one more salvage operation. Even if we accept the moral chain, timing still matters. We cannot ratify structural inclusion under visible pressure from an unknown fleet configuration. That, finally, made Vale ask for the floor again. Recognition came at once. He did not raise his voice. He had spent too long in command to mistake volume for force. With respect, he said, the fleet configuration is not the most relevant pressure in this room. Voss looked at him carefully. And what is? The archive. He let the word settle before continuing. I have served Frontier Command for 29 years. I know what coercion looks like. It announces itself because it wants movement before understanding can harden. This does not resemble that. They approached under silence, responded only after deadband contact, came aboard with records, laid down limited demands, and have neither broadened nor sharpened them once. What pressures this chamber is not the possibility of attack. It is the possibility that the demands are exact that produced the deepest stillness yet, because everyone in the room knew he was right. And because right, in this case, made procedure feel shabby. The vote to advance terms to full ratification review came 31 minutes later. Not unanimous. Not elegant. Not enough to make anyone noble. Enough. The registry restoration clause passed first by clear margin. Archive declassification review passed second by slightly less. Public correction language triggered procedural objections, survived them, and passed on reconsideration after when asked whether the chamber intended to continue preferring fiction now that fiction had become expensive. The representation clause came last and barely crossed on first count, then crossed more cleanly on the challenge recount when 3 abstentions shifted to reluctant support. Direction, not completion. But the room had turned. Outside the chamber, in the narrow corridor where consequential decisions always looked smaller than they felt while happening, Pell found Vale standing by the window slit overlooking the capital's inner ring traffic. Well, Pellet. Vale kept his eyes on the ships moving below. They'll formalize the process. Which means delay. Yes. Pell considered that. Then, because archivists were allowed a certain bluntness after spending their lives cleaning up other people's lies, he said, "Do you think the continuance will care?" Vale almost smiled. "I think," he said, "they counted on it." He sent the result to Border Relay 9 less than 10 minutes later. The message was short. Preliminary approval path established. Full ratification pending. Archive restoration motion active. Delay unavoidable. Leo Anit's reply arrived 14 minutes after that. Understood. We remain in patience. Vale read it once and handed the slate to Pell. Pell looked at the 2 lines and felt, oddly, his heartbeat slow. Not because the matter was settled. Because the answer had exactly the shape it should have had. No outrage. No deadline. No demand for faster motion. Only the calm statement of a people who had not crossed 3 centuries to be surprised by 30 more days of institutional hesitation. Above the Capitol, beyond the ordinary lanes and the official lights, the massed continuance positions held where they had first been detected, dark, exact, and entirely still. They did not need to move. The room already had. On the 5th day after the preliminary vote, nothing happened. That was the problem. Concord institutions knew how to answer movement. They had procedures for incursions, protests, border seizures, labor strikes, embassy walkouts, hunger campaigns, sanctions cascades, piracy bursts, even grief if the grief became large enough to interfere with transport. The machinery of governance had drawers for anything loud. What sat above the Capitol was quiet. The Wayfarer Patience held its position beyond the official traffic shell at a distance so exact that station navigation began using it as a passive calibration point for nearby civilian lanes, which caused a brief argument in 3 departments before someone pointed out that accuracy did not care whether the object providing it had voting rights yet. The massed support ships did not power weapons. Did not close range. Did not broadcast demands. They remained where they were, dark and mathematically placed, as if time itself had been given station-keeping orders. News channels tried very hard to make this dramatic. Unknown fleet continues pressure posture over Capitol. Remnant representatives await chamber action. Military analysts divided on strategic intent. The military analysts were not divided. Pell knew this because he had read the internal summaries after Vale's preliminary report was circulated and because analysts, when writing for each other instead of for public comm, tended to tell the truth in neat, unpleasant language. No hostile intent demonstrated. No escalation indicators. No coercive maneuvering. Continued stillness should not be interpreted as passivity. That last line had been underlined twice by someone in tactical review. Pell appreciated that. At Border Relay 9, Jalen Marr watched the tactical display at the start of each shift and had the same thought every time. They were still there. It should have become less unnerving. That was how fear usually worked with fixed objects. The first day shocked the body, the second day annoyed it, the third day let routine grow back around the edges. But the continuance ships had chosen a form of waiting that did not soften under repetition. Their exactness made them feel less like vessels holding position and more like a verdict the stars had not yet learned to pronounce aloud. Jalen had expected, secretly and a little shamefully, that once the capital entered review the ships would do something to remind everyone they were still relevant. Shift formation. Light drives. Send another message. Ordinary power liked to refresh its image because ordinary power was never quite sure it could afford to be forgotten. The continuance did none of that. Once every standard day, at the same hour, a single narrow transmission left the patients and touched the Concord registry. It asked one question. Current status of designation inquiry. Nothing else. No signature flourish. No urgency. No complaint. Just the same request, phrased in exactly the same language each time, shaped for the archive first and the listener second. For 6 days the registry returned. Pending ratification. The patients acknowledged each reply in one line. Recorded. That was all. Jalen began timing the exchange without meaning to. 14 seconds on the first day. 12 on the second once central systems cut the routing lag. 11 on the third. The contact was becoming ordinary in the way impossible things sometimes did when they refused to help you dramatize them. Chief Engineer Ro Taz hated that more than he hated actual danger. Would it kill them? Ro said on day 7, leaning over Jalen's console with a mug of something too bitter to smell civilized, to be a little less composed. Jalen kept his eyes on the display. You want them angry? No. I want them legible. They are legible. Ro took a drink. That is unfortunately true. In the capital, the delay that had seemed procedural on paper began to change shape under sustained quiet. The first week produced draft language, subcommittee review, authority challenges, and no fewer than 9 proposed alternatives to the representation clause. Observer standing. Limited consultative role. Rotating advisory seat. Deferred parity pending historical review. Each variation was explained in terms so polished they almost disguised the same simple instinct beneath them. Give enough to calm the wound. Not enough to admit where the blade had entered. Then the archive restoration motion began opening files. That was the moment the chamber's cleverness started to die. Pell was there for the 4th release set when the first counselor asked for a recess and did not come back for 26 minutes. He was there for the 6th when a legal aide from Interior Policy read one omission state routing memo, went pale around the mouth, and quietly requested transfer off the review team by evening cycle. He was there for the 9th when Counselor Neve Sarin, who disliked theatrical language almost as much as she disliked being lied to, pushed a folder across the table and said to no one in particular, "We are no longer negotiating with a claim. We are negotiating with our own handwriting." After that, the alternatives weakened. Not because people became brave. Because the room became measurable. Every attempt to soften the public correction clause now had to survive comparison with a growing stack of real files bearing real seals from real Concord predecessor offices instructing subordinate systems to withdraw names, bury routes, and convert populations into omission. Every attempt to reduce representation had to answer a simpler and increasingly fatal question. If the erased had survived long enough to force the archive open, by what remaining logic would the archive's authors reserve the right to speak about the worlds beyond them without the erased in the room? No one had found a good answer yet. Most had stopped pretending one was coming. Vale returned to Border Relay 9 on the 9th day and found the station altered by waiting in ways that had nothing to do with equipment. People spoke more quietly near the tactical boards. Not from fear, exactly. From the instinctive respect human beings sometimes granted to silence that had lasted longer than expected. The patients remained on the main pane. The support ships remained around it, dark and fixed. The daily registry query had already gone out and already been answered and already been recorded. Any change? Vale asked. Jalen almost said no. Then he looked at the board again and realized the answer was more complicated. No movement, he said. No posture shift. No signals outside the daily check. Vale nodded. And the room? Jalen glanced around the sensor bay. The room had changed. Not in function. In relationship. A week ago everyone on the relay had treated the continuance like a suspended event, dangerous because it had not yet resolved into one of the known endings. Now the station had begun, unwillingly, to orient around the fact of them. Traffic routing accounted for them. Shift reports referenced them without adjectives. Navigation staff calibrated against them. Comms technicians had deadband protocol notes pinned where future crews could find them quickly. The impossible had acquired procedures. "We've gotten used to them," Jalen said. Vale looked through the forward screen at the black beyond the station's reflected interior lights. "No," he said after a moment. "We've gotten used to not being able to move them." That was closer. On the 11th day, the continuance sent a second message. Not to the Council. Not to the military. To the archive. Pell was in the records division when it arrived. It contained no pressure language. No accusation. Only an update to their own side of the shared file. Continuity record amended. Concord response remains active. No hostile correction required. Pell read it twice and sat very still with one hand over his mouth. No hostile correction required. Who wrote like that unless hostility had been studied, categorized, and deliberately set aside? He forwarded the message to Vale, then to Counselor Wren, then to the ratification committee because at this point refusing to let them see the moral shape of the thing felt professionally obscene. By the 12th day, the chamber had stopped talking about whether the continuants were applying pressure. The ships had not changed. The waiting had. That was the lesson finally reaching them. Pressure was not always force leaning inward. Sometimes it was dignity held so steadily that every lesser evasion in the room began to look ashamed of itself. Above the Capitol, the massed ships did not move. Above Border Relay 9, the patients held station with that same impossible exactness. And across Concord space, the systems that had once been taught to return empty when asked for the erased had now spent nearly 2 weeks answering the same daily question under the eyes of those who had survived the emptiness long enough to make it procedural. The longer the waiting continued, the less it resembled suspense. The more it resembled certainty taking its time. The ratification session took 14 hours and, in the end, turned on a sentence so small most of the chamber did not realize history had crossed it until they were already standing on the other side. Pell watched from the upper records gallery with a line of sight down to the voting floor and a direct archive feed open across his lap. Commander Vale stood below among Frontier Command observers, hands clasped behind his back, expression unreadable in the way long service sometimes turned a face into discipline. Counselor Wren sat near the center arc under the hard white fall of the chamber lights. Marotane sat 3 tiers to her left, still opposed, still iron about it, but quieter now. Quiet had spread through the opposition over the last week. Not surrender exactly. The more fragile condition that came when moral clarity began stripping language from people who preferred haze. The representation clause failed first. Not by much. By enough. 21-4. 24 against. 3 abstentions. A sound moved through the chamber then, not loud, not dramatic, just the sound of a structure reaching for one of its older reflexes. Delay. Different. Offer less. Rename the injury into something discussable and therefore survivable. Counselor Voss stood at once with a compromise package already in hand. Pell had expected that too. Observer standing. Deferred parity. Conditional review after 10 standard years of monitored participation. It was elegant in the empty way so much governance was elegant. A neat reduction of someone else's reality into something easier for power to live beside without adjusting its posture. Wren asked for the floor before Voss finished reading. She did not speak quickly. That helped. Quick speech always looked like strategy. Slow speech, when done by someone who did not need the room's affection, looked dangerously like truth. "We have spent 12 days, she said, acting as if what sits above this capital is a negotiation over access. She let the sentence settle. It is not. Access was already taken. We are not deciding whether to admit a newcomer. We are deciding whether to continue benefiting from an omission once the omission is proven. There is no procedural variant of justice that remains justice after it has been knowingly reduced for the comfort of the benefited." No applause. Concord chambers did not applaud. But Pell saw the effect all the same. The stillness changed shape. Some people stopped writing. Others began, which was how the more honest sort hid being moved. Voss tried once more. No chamber can absorb structural correction without staged implementation. From the observer line below, Vale asked for recognition. This time the room gave it more slowly, because officers were not supposed to rescue legislators from their own evasions. But they gave it. I received their first contact, Vale said. I received their records. I met their representative. I have now spent 2 weeks watching what they do when delayed. He looked around the chamber, not at Tane or Voss or Rin specifically, but at all of them with the flat steadiness of a man who had no vote and therefore, for once in his career, no use for performance. They did not broaden their demands. They did not sharpen them. They did not threaten. They did not move their ships 1 meter closer. They updated their continuity record and continued to wait. Some of you are reading that as restraint. You are wrong. It is not restraint. It is confidence that reality does not become less true because we process it slowly. He paused. Do not mistake their patience for our advantage. That was the sentence. Pell knew it the moment it landed. The room knew it too, though more reluctantly. Because it removed the last flattering lie available to them. Delay was no longer strategy. It was merely evidence being gathered against the chamber by its own behavior. The second vote came 3 hours later after recesses, corridor bargaining, 2 changed abstentions, and 1 border counselor from the outer rings standing up with visible reluctance to say that if the Concord could reopen shipping treaties from a century ago when minerals were at stake, it could certainly reopen reality when people were. The representation clause passed. Not gloriously. Not cleanly. Irrevocably enough. By evening cycle, the ratification package as a whole had crossed final threshold. Registry restoration. Archive declassification. Public correction. Representational standing. Pell felt the change not in the chamber, which remained what it had always been, over-designed, self-serious, determined to look larger than the people inside it, but in the archive feed on his lap. Pending. 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 Then, one by one, the statuses changed. Terrene umbrella designation, restored. Continuity term human, recognized active. Cluster omission notices, lifted. Historical loss designation, superseded by administrative falsification ruling. Representation class, granted. For one strange second Pell could not move. 3 centuries of disappearance corrected in system text, so plain it might have been a freight authorization. He forwarded the confirmed changes to Border Relay 9, to Commander Vale, to Counselor Wren, and finally, after a pause he did not entirely understand, to the old deadband channel the continuance had first used. At Border Relay 9, Jalen Marr was on watch again when the registry updated. It happened without fanfare. No ceremonial chime. No broad public alert. Just a refresh in the species classification layer that made the tactical side pane blink once and reorder itself. He clicked it open. Human. Continuity classification active. Historical designation restored. Status recognized. Jalen stared at the word active for a long time. Then he opened the long-range board. The Wayfarer patience was still there, fixed against the dark with the same impossible stillness it had held since first arrival. The support positions remained around it, faint and exact. For a moment nothing happened. Then, across the deadband channel, a single transmission arrived. Registry status received. Recorded complete. No celebration. No triumph. A minute later a second message followed, routed to station command but visible in the contact log. Continuity vessel group preparing departure. Representation will arrive by separate route when appropriate. Your archive may keep copies. Jalen laughed once under his breath, not because it was funny, but because after everything the line about the archive felt so perfectly like them it almost eased something in him. Above the capital and beyond the relay, the support ships warmed their drives in sequence. Not hurriedly. Not as a show. One by one, a geometry of preparation becoming motion. Commander Vale stood at the observation glass when the patience began to turn. Pell found him there half an hour later, the registry confirmation slate still in Vale's hand. They're leaving, Pell said. Vale nodded. For now. Pell came to stand beside him. Below them the station lights moved across the inner ring. Farther out, the continuance formation was already changing shape, not dispersing exactly, but unfolding into trajectories laid down long ago and now resumed. Do you think they're satisfied? Pellet. Vale considered that. No, he said at last. I think they've finished this part correctly. That sounded right. The patience aligned on its outbound vector, drives brightening in that old, unclassifiable way. One after another the dark ships around it moved with the same terrible serenity Jalen had first seen on the tactical board, like something that had never doubted the map and had only paused to let the rest of the world catch up to where it had been headed all along. On the Capital feed, the public correction notice went live 12 minutes later. 3 predecessor administrations of the Concord had participated in omission state actions resulting in the deliberate removal of recognized populations from active registry reality. Said populations survived outside official recognition. Prior historical loss designations are null where contradicted by continuity evidence. Restored designation follows. The wording was bureaucratic, ashamed, insufficient. It was also true. Pell watched it spread through the public channels and thought of sealed files, dead bands, junior survey notes, a black case full of paper, and a people who had spent 109 years recording empty answers without ever letting the emptiness become definition. On Border Relay 9, Jalen turned the display off only after the last continuance drive had faded into the long dark beyond the route line. Then he sat there for another minute with his hands still on the console, listening to the room become ordinary around him again in fragments. Quiet speech. Row Taz swearing at a maintenance panel down the row. The small familiar noises of systems that had survived being corrected. For the first time since the silver ring had appeared on his screen, the station did not feel as if it were waiting for something unnamed to happen. It felt recorded. And in the registry now, where an absence had lived longer than most careers, a people existed again under their own continuity, active in the official world not because power had finally chosen generosity, but because patience had outlived erasure and arrived prepared to make the word impossible to refuse.